Josephine pressed her trembling fingers against the bullet wound in the stranger's chest, his blood warm and thick beneath her palms. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of too many battlefield memories. The man's eyes flickered open, pale and startling against the dirt caked on his scarred face. "Let me go." He rasped his hand, gripping her wrist with desperate strength. "The town will destroy you for touching me." She held his gaze, her jaw set with the same defiance that had carried her through war. "Then let them try." In that moment between life and death, something unspoken passed between two damaged souls who had both learned that survival meant accepting help from the most unlikely places. Before we continue this powerful story of redemption and forbidden love, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and follow this journey to the very end. Please comment below with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far our story has traveled across the world. Josephine had survived the Civil War by learning to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that this bleeding man in the Colorado dirt deserved more than the death the town seemed eager to grant him. She ripped fabric from her petticoat. Without hesitation, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had staunched too many wounds to count. "What's your name?" she demanded, her voice sharp with authority. The man's laugh was bitter, almost cruel. "Does it matter? You'll hear it soon enough, always preceded by curses." "I asked you a question." Josephine applied pressure to the wound, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. "I don't care what curses come with it." "Archer," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Archer Grayson. And you've just signed your death warrant by helping me." She had arrived in Redemption Creek that morning with nothing but a worn leather trunk and a teaching certificate that had cost her the last of her savings. The town's main street stretched before her like a promise of new beginnings, false-fronted buildings that spoke of frontier optimism and desperate hope. The stage driver had deposited her and her belongings outside the boarding house with barely a word, his eyes already scanning the horizon for threats that seemed to live in every shadow of this hard land. Mrs. Halloway. The boarding house proprietor had greeted her with tight-lipped courtesy. "You're the new schoolteacher then. We've been expecting you, Miss Summers. Though I'll tell you plain, you've walked into a hornet's nest of trouble." Josephine had smiled politely, her stomach nodding with familiar anxiety. Every new town brought the same warning delivered in different words, but always carrying the same message: you don't belong here, and you never will. But it wasn't until she decided to walk the perimeter of the small town, familiarizing herself with the landscape that would become her home, that she stumbled upon the scene that would alter the course of her carefully planned life. The man lay crumpled near a dried creek bed, his shirt soaked with blood, his breathing shallow and labored. Now, as she worked to save him, Josephine became aware of eyes watching from a distance. 3 men on horseback, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, made no move to approach or offer assistance. "Your friends?" she asked Archer, her tone acidic. "My executioners, more like." Archer's voice was growing stronger, though his face remained deathly pale. "That's Thomas Holloway, the banker, his cousin Marcus, the deputy, and Samuel Chen, who owns the general store. They're probably taking bets on how long it takes for you to realize your mistake." Josephine tied off the makeshift bandage with aggressive efficiency. "The only mistake I see is a town that lets a man bleed to death while they watch." "You don't understand what you're interfering with." "Then explain it to me." She sat back on her heels, her dress ruined beyond repair, her hands stained with his blood. "Why would anyone shoot you and leave you to die?" Archer's eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her breath catch. Not fear, not anger, but a weariness so profound it seemed to have etched itself into his very bones. "Because they believe I killed 7 men 2 years ago. Set fire to the mine shaft with them trapped inside. They believe I'm a murderer who got away with it because there wasn't enough evidence to hang me. And are you?" The question hung between them like a blade. "No." His voice was steady, unflinching. "But truth doesn't matter much in Redemption Creek. What matters is who controls the narrative, and Gerald Blackwell has controlled it since the day his daughter accused me of the crime. Josephine helped him sit up slowly, her arm supporting his weight. Can you stand? I can try. Getting him to his feet was an exercise in stubborn determination on both their parts. Archer's ranch, he told her through gritted teeth, was 2 miles west beyond the reach of the town's self-appointed moral guardians. Josephine refused to let him walk it alone. The 3 horsemen had disappeared by the time they began their slow journey, but Josephine felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking their every step. The sun was setting, painting the Colorado landscape in shades of blood and gold, when they finally reached the small ranch house that Archer called home. You should go back, Archer said, as she helped him onto the porch, before they connect you to me permanently. I'm already connected to you. Josephine pushed open the door without waiting for permission. The moment I chose to save your life, instead of walking past like a good Christian woman should. The interior of this house was sparse, but clean, speaking of a man who lived alone but maintained standards. Josephine guided Archer to a chair near the cold fireplace, then set about building a fire without asking if he wanted one. You're not afraid of me, Archer observed, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Should I be? Most people are. Josephine struck a match, watching the kindling catch. Most people are fools. She turned to face him, her expression serious. I was a nurse during the war, Mr. Grayson. I've seen what men are capable of when they're truly evil. You don't carry that darkness. You can tell that after knowing me for an hour. I can tell that from the way you tried to send me away, even while you were bleeding to death. She crossed to him, checking his bandage with professional detachment. Evil men don't worry about the reputations of strange women who help them. Archer's hand caught her wrist, gently stopping her movements. The scars on my face, do they bother you? She looked at him fully, then, really seeing him for the first time. The scars were extensive, running from his left temple, down to his jaw, puckered and pale against his sun-weathered skin. But they didn't repel her. If anything, they made him more human, more real than the sanitized heroes of dime novels and Sunday sermons. They tell me you've survived something terrible, she said simply. That's nothing to be ashamed of. He released her wrist, his expression unreadable. The mine fire. I went in to try to save them, even though they'd already accused me of setting it. Didn't matter. The tunnel collapsed before I could reach anyone. These scars are my prize for playing hero. Tell me what really happened. Josephine pulled up a second chair, settling in with the patience of someone accustomed to extracting difficult truths. From the beginning. And so, as the fire crackled and night fell completely outside, Archer told her a story of betrayal that began with love and ended in flames. Sarah Blackwell, the mine owner's daughter, had promised to marry him. They had been engaged for 6 months when Archer discovered her father's plans to divert the creek that fed both the town's water supply and Archer's ranch, redirecting it to serve only Blackwell's mining operations. I confronted Gerald Blackwell, Archer said, his voice hollow with old pain. Told him I'd go to the territorial authorities if he didn't abandon his scheme. 3 days later, the mine exploded. 7 men dead. And Sarah, my Sarah, stood before the whole town and swore I'd threatened to destroy her father's legacy if she didn't marry me. She lied. It wasn't a question. She chose her father over truth. Archer's hands clenched into fists. And I've been paying for it ever since. Josephine absorbed this information, her mind working through the implications. Why didn't they arrest you? No evidence. The explosion could have been accidental gas buildup, faulty equipment. But Blackwell made sure everyone knew what he believed, and in a town like this, belief is as good as proof. But you stayed. Josephine leaned forward. Why not leave, start over somewhere no one knows your name? Because leaving would be admitting guilt. Archer's eyes blazed with sudden intensity. And because this land is mine. My father built this ranch from nothing, and I'll be damned if I let Gerald Blackwell drive me off it. A knock at the door interrupted them, sharp and authoritative. Josephine rose to answer it, but Archer's hand shot out to stop her. Don't. The knock came again, harder this time. Archer Grayson. We know you're in there. Send the woman out. Josephine recognized the voice from earlier. Thomas Holloway, the banker. She moved toward the door, despite Archer's protest, pulling it open, to reveal 3 men standing on the porch, their faces grim in the lamplight. Miss Summers, I presume? Holloway removed his hat with exaggerated politeness. We've come to escort you back to town before your reputation is completely destroyed. My reputation is my own concern, Mr. Holloway. Josephine kept her voice level, though her heart pounded. And I go where I please. Marcus the deputy stepped forward. His badge caught the light, and Josephine noted the way his hand rested casually on his gun belt. Ma'am, you don't understand what kind of man you're defending. Archer Grayson is dangerous. Funny, Josephine said, her tone turning sharp as a knife. He's not the one who shot him and left him to die. Perhaps you should examine where the real danger lies. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock across the men's faces. Samuel Chen, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. That shooting was justified. Grayson was trespassing on Blackwell land. I was checking my water rights, Archer called from inside the house, his voice carrying despite his weakened state. That creek belongs to everyone, not just Gerald Blackwell. The territorial survey says otherwise, Holloway countered. Mr. Blackwell has documents. Forged documents, Archer interrupted. And we all know it. Josephine watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about a mine explosion or a broken engagement. This was about power, about water, about who would control the future of Redemption Creek. And Archer, with his refusal to be intimidated, stood in the way of that control. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decision. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I'm a grown woman who survived 4 years of war. I think I can manage one wounded rancher. You're making a grave mistake, Marcus said, his voice low and threatening. Then it's mine to make. Josephine stepped back and closed the door firmly in their faces. When she turned, she found Archer watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You just made yourself an enemy of the most powerful man in 3 counties. Good, Josephine said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. I've always preferred being on the side of right over the side of powerful. The night deepened around them as Archer's fever began to spike, the inevitable result of trauma and blood loss. Josephine worked through the dark hours with the same determination she'd brought to field hospitals, bathing his forehead with cool water, monitoring his breathing, changing his bandages when fresh blood seeped through. In his delirium, Archer called out for Sarah, pleading with her to tell the truth, his voice breaking with anguish that made Josephine's chest tight with sympathetic pain. By dawn, the fever had broken, leaving Archer weak, but lucid. Josephine sat beside his bed, exhausted, but unwilling to leave him alone. You stayed? He said, his voice rough from hours of unconscious ranting. Of course I stayed. Why? The question was simple, but Josephine heard the complexity beneath it. Why would anyone choose to align themselves with a man the entire town had marked as untouchable? She considered her answer carefully. Because someone once told me that the measure of a person isn't found in their worst moment, but in how they respond when everything is taken from them. You've lost your reputation, your fiancé, nearly your life, and still you refuse to surrender your principles. That tells me more about your character than any accusation ever could. Archer's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion. I heard what you said to Holloway, about being on the side of right. I meant it. It's going to cost you. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. The teaching position, your standing in the community, everything you came here to build. Josephine smiled, and there was something fierce in the expression. Mr. Grayson, I came to Redemption Creek to teach children to read and think for themselves. If the town would rather I teach them to bow to corrupt power, then they never wanted a teacher at all. They wanted a puppet. Call me Archer. Only if you call me Josephine. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, but this time it was softer, almost hesitant. Josephine opened it to find a small Mexican woman standing on the porch, a basket covered with a cloth in her hands. "I am Rosa Martinez," the woman said in heavily accented English. "I bring food. For Senor Archer." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "They say I should not come, but Archer, he helped my husband when the mine collapsed. He tried to save Miguel." Her eyes filled with tears. "Miguel die anyway, but Archer he try. He almost die too. I know the truth, even if others forget." Josephine accepted the basket with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Martinez. Your kindness means more than you know." Rosa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You be careful, señorita. Blackwell, he is dangerous man. He take what he want, and he destroy anyone who stand in his way. Miguel, he know about the fake papers, about the water rights. That is why the mine explode. Not accident, not Archer. Blackwell." The words hung in the air like a confession, and Josephine felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. Did Miguel tell anyone else? He tried to tell the sheriff. 3 days later, the sheriff he have an accident. Fall from his horse, they say. Break his neck. Rosa's hands trembled. "Everyone who know the truth, they end up dead or run out of town. You save Archer's life, señorita. But now you must save your own." After Rosa left, Josephine shared the information with Archer, who received it with grim acknowledgement rather than surprise. Miguel was a good man. He died because he wouldn't look the other way. "How many others?" Josephine asked. "At least 4 that I know of. All men who questioned Blackwell's claim to the water rights. All dead or disappeared within months of speaking up." Archer's expression hardened. "And now you're caught in it too." "Then we need evidence," Josephine said, her mind already working through possibilities. "Real evidence that can't be dismissed or ignored. Something that proves Blackwell forged those documents." "The Territorial Land Office would have the original survey maps," Archer said slowly. "But it's a 3-day ride to Denver, and Blackwell has friends there." "Then we'll need to be smarter than his friends." Archer studied her with new respect. "You're not what I expected when I heard the town was getting a new school teacher." "What did you expect?" "Someone soft, someone who would fold at the first sign of trouble." Josephine's laugh was short and humorless. "Mr. Grayson Archer, I held soldiers' hands while they died screaming. I amputated limbs with a saw that had been used on 20 men before. I watched an entire hospital tent burn with patients still inside because there was no time to evacuate them all. Trouble doesn't frighten me anymore. What frightens me is watching good people suffer while cowards with power prosper." The intensity in her voice seemed to reach something deep inside Archer. He sat up slowly, wincing at the pull of his wound, and held out his hand. "Partners, then, in seeking the truth." Josephine clasped his hand, feeling the calluses earned from years of ranch work, the strength tempered by recent trauma. "Partners." Neither of them spoke the obvious truth that partnership in this fight meant they would either clear Archer's name together or go down fighting Blackwell's corruption together. There was no middle ground, no safe retreat. The moment Josephine had pressed her hands against Archer's bleeding chest, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in a place she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge yet, Josephine realized that the flutter in her chest when Archer looked at her had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a connection she had never expected to find in this hard, unforgiving land. The school board met 3 days later in the back room of Holloway's Bank, and Josephine walked into that meeting knowing her entire future in Redemption Creek hung in the balance. 6 men sat around a polished oak table, their faces arranged in expressions ranging from pity to outright hostility. Gerald Blackwell occupied the head of the table like a king holding court, his silver hair and expensive suit marking him as a man who had never known what it meant to go without. "Miss Summers," he began, his voice dripping with false concern. "We've heard disturbing reports about your first few days in our community." Josephine set her worn teaching satchel on the table with deliberate care. I've heard disturbing reports about this community's first few days with me, Mr. Blackwell. Perhaps we're even." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Thomas Holloway cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Summers, you must understand our position. We hired you to educate our children, not to involve yourself in local disputes. I wasn't aware that saving a man's life constituted involvement in a dispute." Josephine met each man's eyes in turn. "Unless you're suggesting I should have let Mr. Grayson bleed to death in the street." "Grayson is a murderer," Blackwell said flatly. "A man who killed 7 innocent minors, including Rosa Martinez's husband. Your association with him calls into question your moral judgment." "Strange." Josephine pulled a folded paper from her satchel. "Mrs. Martinez brought me food at Mr. Grayson's ranch just yesterday. She seemed quite convinced of his innocence." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Blackwell's genial mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Rosa is a simple woman confused by grief. She doesn't understand the complexity of the situation." "Perhaps you could explain it to me then?" Josephine unfolded the paper, Rosa's written statement laboriously composed in broken English, but legally witnessed by the town's notary. "Because Mrs. Martinez states here that her husband discovered evidence of forged land documents weeks before the mine explosion. She also states that he reported this to the previous sheriff, who died in a convenient riding accident 3 days later." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to hold its breath. Reverend Sullivan, the oldest member of the board, finally spoke. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Summers. Do you have proof?" "I have a widow's testimony. I have a pattern of deaths surrounding anyone who questions Mr. Blackwell's water rights claims. And I have a man who nearly died trying to save the very miners he's accused of killing." Josephine's voice rang with conviction. "What I don't have is a single shred of evidence suggesting Archer Grayson is anything other than a scapegoat for someone else's crimes." Blackwell stood so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. "This is outrageous. I will not sit here and be slandered by some interfering woman who's been in town less than a week." "Then perhaps you should leave," Josephine suggested calmly. "This is a school board meeting, not a courtroom. Though from what I understand you've worked very hard to ensure certain matters never see the inside of a courtroom." "You're fired." Blackwell's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "Effective immediately. Pack your things and be on tomorrow's stage." Josephine turned to the other board members. "Does Mr. Blackwell speak for all of you? Or do some of you still believe in due process and the presumption of innocence?" The men shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Dr. Brennan, who had been silent throughout, raised his hand. "I vote to retain Miss Summers. We haven't even given her a chance to teach yet." "I second that," Reverend Sullivan said quietly. "The girl has spirit, and our children could use a teacher who isn't afraid to stand up for what's right." The vote split 3-3 with Marcus Holloway and Samuel Chen siding with Blackwell. It was the 7th member, elderly Mr. Patterson, who owned the feed store, who broke the tie. "Keep her," he said, his voice reedy but firm. "My granddaughter needs a teacher who'll show her that women can be brave. God knows this town could use a reminder of what courage looks like." Josephine felt something crack open in her chest. Gratitude mixed with determination and a fierce protectiveness for these few men who had chosen principle over power. But Blackwell's expression, as he stormed from the room, told her she had just made the most dangerous enemy of her life. The first day of school arrived with autumn crispness in the air, and 23 children crowded into the small schoolhouse. Josephine stood before them, these children of miners and ranchers and shopkeepers, and saw the future of Redemption Creek staring back at her with curious eyes. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Miss Summers, and I'm here to teach you how to think, not what to think. There's a difference, and it's important you understand it from the start." A girl in the front row raised her hand timidly. "Miss Summers, my pa says you're friends with the man who killed those miners. Is that true?" Josephine had known this moment would come, but the directness of it still stole her breath. "What's your name? Emma Blackwell, ma'am. Of course. Gerald Blackwell's granddaughter planted in the front row like a spy in miniature. Josephine crouched down to Emma's level, meeting the child's eyes with gentle honesty. I'm friends with a man named Archer Grayson, who was accused of a terrible crime but never proven guilty. Do you know what innocent until proven guilty means, Emma? The girl shook her head. It means that in America we don't punish people based on accusations alone. We require evidence, proof, and we give every person a fair chance to defend themselves. Josephine stood addressing the entire class now. That's one of the most important lessons you'll ever learn. It's easy to believe what people tell you. It's much harder to think for yourself and demand the truth. She saw understanding dawn on several young faces, and something else too, the beginning of doubt about the stories they'd been fed their entire lives. It was a small victory, but victories had to start somewhere. That afternoon, as Josephine dismissed the children, she found Archer waiting outside the schoolhouse, his horse tied to the fence post. He looked better than he had 3 days ago, though still pale and moving with careful deliberation. You shouldn't be here, Josephine said, even as relief flooded through her at the sight of him upright and breathing. Probably not. Archer's smile was slight, but genuine. But I wanted to see how your first day went. I made an enemy of Gerald Blackwell's granddaughter by teaching her about due process. So a complete success then. Josephine laughed despite herself, the sound bright and unexpected in the late afternoon air. I suppose that's one way to look at it. She glanced around, noting the curtains twitching in nearby windows, the eyes tracking their every move. People are watching. Let them watch. Archer's voice carried quiet defiance. I spent 2 years hiding from their judgment. I'm done with that. Archer. I found something. He pulled a folded document from his jacket. The original territorial survey map dated 1873. I rode to the land office in Denver while you were settling in. This map shows the creek running through my property, not Blackwell's. Josephine's hands trembled as she unfolded the document. The lines were clear, the measurements precise, and the signature at the bottom belonged to a federal surveyor, not a local official Blackwell could have bribed or intimidated. This is it, she whispered. This proves he forged the newer survey. It proves the older survey contradicts his claims. Whether that's enough to overturn his water rights is another question. Archer's expression was grim. But it's a start. I'm taking this to the territorial judge next week. He'll fight you. I know. That's why I need you to keep this copy safe. Archer pressed a second carefully folded document into her hands. If anything happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. Josephine's voice was fiercer than she intended. We're not going to let him win. The intensity between them shifted, becoming something charged and fragile. Archer's hand lingered on hers, his thumb brushing against her knuckles in a gesture that felt both tentative and inevitable. Josephine. The crack of a gunshot split the air, and Archer jerked backward, his shoulder blooming red. Josephine screamed, catching him as he fell, her mind already cataloging the wound. High and to the right, might have missed the lung, but definitely hit muscle and possibly bone. Get inside, Archer gasped, trying to push her toward the schoolhouse door. But Josephine had already spotted the shooter, a figure on horseback silhouetted against the setting sun, rifle still smoking. She dragged Archer through the schoolhouse door, kicking it shut behind them and throwing the bolt. You have got to stop getting shot, she told him, her hands already working to staunch the blood flow. I'll add it to my list of things to improve. Archer's attempt at humor was undercut by the pain etched across his face. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving them alone in the gathering darkness. Josephine worked by lamplight, her training taking over as she cleaned and bound the wound with strips torn from her petticoat, a garment that was rapidly being sacrificed to Archer's survival. This has to stop, she said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. Blackwell can't just keep shooting you and expecting to get away with it. He's not the one pulling the trigger. Archer's breathing was labored but steady. He's too smart for that. He has men who do his dirty work. Then we expose his men. We make them testify against him. With what leverage they're more afraid of Blackwell than they are of justice? Josephine sat back on her heels, her mind racing through possibilities. Then we find someone who isn't afraid. Someone who has more to lose by staying silent than by speaking up. Who? Sarah Blackwell. Archer's expression shuddered immediately. Absolutely not. She lied about you once. Maybe she can be convinced to tell the truth now. She chose her father over me, over 7 dead men. What makes you think she'd suddenly grow a conscience? Because, Josephine said gently, people can change. And because living with that kind of lie eats away at a person. I've seen it. The guilt becomes unbearable eventually. You're assuming she feels guilty. I'm assuming she's human. And humans, even weak ones, have a breaking point. Archer studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his gaze. You see the best in people, don't you? Even when they don't deserve it. I see the potential for redemption. There's a difference. What about me? The question was quiet, almost vulnerable. Do you see potential for redemption in me? Josephine's hand found his uninjured shoulder, her touch gentle but certain. You don't need redemption, Archer. You need vindication, and I'm going to help you get it. The next morning, Josephine visited Sarah Blackwell at the grand house on the hill that overlooked the town like a fortress. The maid who answered the door looked uncertain, but Sarah herself appeared in the hallway, her beauty marred by dark circles under her eyes and a haunted expression that spoke of sleepless nights. Miss Summers, I wondered when you'd come calling. May I speak with you privately, Miss Blackwell? Sarah glanced over her shoulder, then nodded curtly. The garden. My father is in his study, and these walls have ears. They walked through manicured paths, lined with roses that were already beginning to wither with the approaching cold. Sarah moved like a ghost, her steps hesitant, her hands twisting together nervously. You came to ask me about Archer, Sarah said before Josephine could speak. Everyone does eventually. I came to ask you about the truth. Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. The truth. The truth is that I loved him. God help me, I loved him more than I've ever loved anything in my life. Then why did you lie? Because my father told me that if I didn't, Archer would hang. He said the territorial authorities were looking for someone to blame for the mine disaster, and if I didn't give them Archer, they'd start investigating my father's business practices. Sarah's voice cracked. He said Archer would die either way, but at least this way there wouldn't be enough evidence for a conviction. He'd lose his reputation, but he'd keep his life. Josephine felt the pieces clicking into place. So you lied to save him. I destroyed him to save him, and I've been living with that choice every day since. Sarah turned to face Josephine, tears streaming down her face. I watch him from my window sometimes, riding past on his way to check the water rights. I see how alone he is, how the town treats him like a leper. And I know I did that to him. Then undo it. Josephine grabbed Sarah's hands, holding them tightly. Tell the truth now. It's not too late. My father will kill me. Your father is killing Archer. Someone shot him again yesterday right outside the schoolhouse. How many times does he have to survive murder attempts before you find the courage to speak? Sarah pulled her hands away, backing toward the house. You don't understand. My father controls everything. The bank, the mine, the water rights, half the businesses in town. If I testify against him, he'll destroy me. He'll make sure I never work, never marry, never have a life. And if you don't, Josephine's voice was gentle but relentless. How do you live with yourself when Archer finally doesn't survive, when your silence gets him killed? I can't. I won't. Please leave. Sarah fled toward the house, her skirts billowing behind her. Josephine stood alone in the garden, frustration and disappointment warring in her chest. She had hoped for an easy victory, a dramatic confession that would unravel Blackwell's power. Instead, she had found a woman trapped by her own cowardice and a father's manipulation. But she had also learned something crucial. Gerald Blackwell had orchestrated the entire accusation against Archer, which meant there was evidence somewhere of his involvement in the mine explosion. She just had to find it. That evening, Josephine found herself at Archer's ranch again, unable to stay away, despite the danger it posed to both their reputations. He sat on the porch, his arm in a sling, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. "Sarah won't help us," Josephine reported, settling into the chair beside him. "I could have told you that. She still loves you. She said so." Archer's expression didn't change. "Love that doesn't have the courage to act isn't love at all. It's just sentiment." Josephine absorbed this, hearing the pain beneath his matter-of-fact tone. "She was trying to protect you. Her father told her you'd hang if she didn't give them your name. So she gave them my name, my reputation, and my future, some protection. People make terrible choices when they're afraid, Archer. It doesn't excuse what she did, but it explains it. You're defending her." There was no accusation in his voice, only weary resignation. "I'm trying to understand her. There's a difference." Josephine shifted in her chair, studying his profile against the fading light. "But you're right. Love without courage is just another form of betrayal." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that felt earned rather than awkward. Finally, Archer spoke again, his voice low and rough with emotion. "When you showed up at the school yesterday, when I saw you standing there alive and unhurt, I realized something. I realized I've been more afraid of you getting hurt because of me than I've been of dying myself. And that's when I knew." "Knew what?" He turned to face her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That I'm falling in love with you. And that terrifies me more than anything Gerald Blackwell could do." Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs, every nerve in her body suddenly alive and singing. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me or turned against me. My parents dead in a wagon accident when I was 17. Sarah lost to her father's ambition. And now you brave, stubborn impossible, you putting yourself in danger every day just by standing beside me. I'm not Sarah." Josephine reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I don't break easily, and I don't run when things get hard. The war taught me that." "The war also taught you what it means to lose people." "Yes. It taught me that love is worth the risk of loss. That connection is worth the pain of grief. That living fully is worth the possibility of heartbreak." She squeezed his hand. "I'm falling in love with you too, Archer, and I'm not afraid of it." The kiss happened as naturally as breathing, his lips finding hers, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence that had marked their every interaction so far. Josephine tasted salt and copper, the remnants of pain and survival. But underneath it all was something sweet and true, a promise of what could be if they just survived long enough to claim it. When they finally broke apart, Archer rested his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers in the gathering darkness. "I don't deserve you." "Shut up." Josephine's laugh was breathless and genuine. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I'm going to make sure you get it." But even as they sat there wrapped in each other's presence and the fragile hope of a shared future, Josephine's mind was already working through their next moves. Sarah wouldn't testify willingly, but there were other ways to expose Blackwell's crimes. The territorial survey was evidence, but they needed more. They needed the forged documents themselves, proof that Blackwell had manufactured evidence to steal the water rights, which meant they needed to break into Gerald Blackwell's study and take what didn't belong to them. Josephine had never imagined herself as a thief, but war had taught her that sometimes survival required actions you never thought yourself capable of. And Archer's survival, both physical and legal, required that she become whatever was necessary. "I need to get into your father's study," she told Archer later that night as they sat at his kitchen table planning their strategy. Absolutely not. We need those forged documents. We both know they exist. And we both know that if you're caught, Blackwell will have you arrested or worse. Archer's voice was firm. I won't let you take that risk. It's not your choice to make. Josephine met his eyes steadily. I'm not asking your permission, Archer. I'm informing you of my decision. Josephine, do you trust me? The question hung between them. Finally, Archer nodded slowly. With my life. Then trust me with this. I know what I'm doing. She didn't, not really. But she knew that standing still meant watching Archer die by inches, his spirit crushed by a town's hatred and a powerful man's lies. And that was something she refused to accept. The plan came together over the next 3 days. The annual church social would draw most of the town to the community hall, including Gerald Blackwell and his household staff. Sarah would be expected to attend, playing the role of dutiful daughter and gracious hostess. It would give Josephine a window, small but sufficient to search Blackwell's study. The night of the social arrived cold, and clear stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Josephine dressed carefully in her best dress, the one that made her look like a proper schoolteacher, rather than a woman planning to commit burglary. She attended the first hour of the social, making conversation with parents and dancing once with Dr. Brennan, establishing her presence so no one would wonder where she'd gone. Then, pleading a headache, she slipped away into the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Blackwell's mansion loomed dark against the starlit sky, only one lamp burning in an upstairs window where a housemaid had been left behind to tend to the elderly cook. Josephine's hands shook as she tested the study window she'd deliberately left unlatched earlier that week when she'd visited Sarah. The wood frame gave with a soft creak that sounded like thunder in her ears. She climbed through her skirts, catching on the sill her breathing so loud she was certain the entire town could hear it. The study smelled of cigars and leather, of power and privilege that came from crushing anyone who stood in the way. Josephine struck a match, shielding the flame with her hand, as she moved toward the massive desk that dominated the room. The drawers were locked. Of course they were locked. She pulled a hairpin from her carefully arranged hair, her fingers remembering the trick a Union spy had taught her during the war angle. It just so apply pressure, feel for the tumbler. The first drawer opened with a satisfying click. Nothing but correspondence. Bills of sale. Mining reports. She moved to the second drawer, her heart hammering against her ribs. More papers, contracts, ledgers filled with numbers that meant nothing without context. The third drawer held a leather portfolio embossed with Gerald Blackwell's initials in gold. Josephine opened it with trembling hands and found what she'd been searching for: 2 territorial survey maps side by side. One dated 1873, showing the creek running through Archer's property. The other dated 1875, showing the creek diverted to Blackwell land. But the signatures were different. The paper quality inconsistent, and when Josephine held them both up to the lamplight, she could see where the newer map had been altered. Creek lines, redrawn, property boundaries, shifted with careful forgery. She was so focused on the documents that she didn't hear the door open until a voice cut through the silence like a blade. Well, well, the schoolteacher turns burglar. Josephine spun around, the maps still clutched in her hands, to find Gerald Blackwell standing in the doorway. He wasn't alone. Thomas Holloway flanked him on one side, Marcus on the other, both men wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. I knew you'd come eventually, Blackwell said, his voice carrying the smug certainty of a man who had anticipated every move. Sarah told me about your visit, about your questions. I've been watching you ever since, waiting for you to do something supremely stupid. Congratulations. You exceeded my expectations. Josephine's mind raced, calculating distances, escape routes, possibilities. The window behind her was still open, but she'd never make it through before they grabbed her. The door was blocked. Her only weapon was the truth she held in her hands. "These maps prove you're a fraud," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You forged territorial documents to steal water rights from multiple landowners, including Archer Grayson. Those maps prove nothing except that you broke into my home and stole my property." Blackwell stepped into the room, his eyes cold and calculating. "Marcus, as deputy, I believe you should arrest Miss Summers for burglary." Marcus moved forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Josephine backed against the desk, her mind screaming for a solution, any solution. "If you arrest me, I'll tell everyone what I found here. I'll tell them about the forgery, about the mine explosion, about Miguel Martinez and the sheriff, and everyone else who died questioning your claims." "And who will believe you?" Blackwell's smile was cruel. "A woman who's been in town less than a month, who's been openly consorting with a known murderer who committed a felony to obtain supposed evidence. My dear Miss Summers, you've destroyed your own credibility." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. He'd manipulated her into this exact position, knowing she'd come, knowing she'd take the bait, knowing he could use her desperation against her. However, Blackwell continued, settling into the chair behind his desk with the ease of a man who had won. "I'm prepared to be merciful. Give me those maps, leave town on tomorrow's stage, and I'll convince Marcus here not to press charges. And if I refuse, then you'll spend the next 5 years in territorial prison, while Archer Grayson bleeds out in some ditch shot by persons unknown. Your choice, Miss Summers. Your freedom and his life, or your pride, and both your deaths." Josephine looked down at the maps in her hands, at the proof that could clear Archer's name, if anyone would believe it, at the evidence that was also her confession of criminal trespass. Her throat tightened with rage and helplessness. "I need time to think." "You have until I count to 10. Blackwell pulled out his pocket watch, the gold chain glinting in the lamplight. 1, 2, 3. "Stop!" The voice came from the doorway, sharp and authoritative. Dr. Brennan stood there, his medical bag in one hand, his expression thunderous. "Gerald, what in God's name are you doing?" "Dealing with a criminal, James. Nothing that concerns you." "Everything about this concerns me." Brennan stepped into the room, his presence somehow making it feel less like a trap. "I came to check on your cook. She sent word she was feeling poorly. Instead, I find you intimidating a young woman in the middle of the night." "She broke into my home." "And why would she do that?" Brennan's eyes moved to the maps in Josephine's hands. "What's she holding, Gerald?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, Josephine made her decision. She handed the maps to Dr. Brennan, watching his face as he examined them, seeing understanding dawn in his eyes. "These show different property lines for the creek," Brennan said slowly. "The dates are 2 years apart, but they contradict each other." "The newer one is forged," Josephine said. "Look at the signature, the paper quality, the way the creek line has been redrawn. Mr. Blackwell created false documents to steal water rights." Brennan studied the maps for a long moment, then looked at Blackwell with something that might have been disappointment or might have been long-suppressed suspicion, finally confirmed. "Is this true, Gerald?" "Of course not. She's lying, trying to deflect from her own crimes." "Then you won't mind if I take these maps to the Territorial Surveyor's office for authentication." Brennan folded them carefully, tucking them into his jacket. "If they're legitimate, as you claim, the surveyor will confirm it. If they've been altered, well. That's a federal crime, Gerald. One that even your money can't buy your way out of." Blackwell's face had gone purple with rage. "You're stealing my property, James. I'll have you arrested alongside her." "I'm confiscating potential evidence of fraud. There's a difference." Brennan turned to Josephine. "Come with me, Miss Summers. Now." They walked out together, leaving Blackwell's sputtering threats behind them. Marcus made no move to stop them, and Josephine realized with a shock that the deputy's loyalty might not be as absolute as Blackwell believed. The night air hit her face like a blessing, cold and clean after the suffocating tension of the study. "Thank you," Josephine managed her voice shaking with delayed reaction. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived. Nothing good. Brennan's voice was grim. But Josephine and I'm calling you that because formality seems ridiculous after this. You took a tremendous risk. If I hadn't been there, Blackwell would have destroyed you. If I hadn't gone, Archer would have no chance at vindication. Is it vindication you're after, or is it something more? Josephine met his eyes, seeing understanding there. Both. I love him, Dr. Brennan, and I won't stand by while this town crucifies him for crimes he didn't commit. Then you'd better prepare yourself for war, because Gerald Blackwell doesn't lose gracefully, and he certainly doesn't forgive. Brennan handed her the maps. Get these to Archer tonight. Tomorrow morning I'm taking them to Denver myself. But you need to understand something. Once this becomes public, there's no going back. Lives will change. The town will tear itself apart. Are you ready for that? I've been ready since the moment I pressed my hands against Archer's bleeding chest and chose to save him. Josephine took the maps, feeling their weight like a sacred trust. This town needs to tear itself apart. Sometimes that's the only way to rebuild something better. She rode to Archer's ranch through darkness so complete, it felt like moving through ink, guided only by starlight and the familiarity of a path she'd traveled too many times in too short a span. When she burst through his door, still breathless from the ride, Archer was on his feet in an instant, his gun drawn, his face tight with alarm. It's me, Josephine gasped. I got them! I got the maps! Archer lowered the gun, his expression shifting from alarm to something that looked like terror. You went into Blackwell's house. Tonight. While he was there. He came back early. He was waiting for me. Josephine spread the maps on his table, her hands still shaking. But Dr. Brennan showed up, and he took my side, and he's taking these to Denver tomorrow to have them authenticated. He could have killed you. Archer's voice was barely above a whisper, but the rage and fear in it made Josephine look up sharply. He could have shot you and claimed self-defense, a burglar in his home, and there wouldn't have been a damn thing anyone could do about it. But he didn't, and now we have evidence. At what cost? Archer grabbed her shoulders, his grip almost painful. Don't you understand? You're not expendable. You're not some chess piece to be sacrificed for my vindication. You're... His voice broke. You're everything. Josephine's breath caught at the naked emotion in his face, the terror that came from caring about someone more than yourself. She reached up, cupping his scarred cheek in her palm. I'm also not fragile. I made a choice, Archer. Just like you made a choice to run into that burning mine shaft, even though everyone had already turned against you. We make these choices because they're right, not because they're safe. He pulled her against him, his arms tight around her, his face buried in her hair. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate wars, clinging to the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The knock on the door came just before dawn, harsh and insistent. Archer answered it to find Reverend Sullivan standing on the porch, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like grief. There's been a town meeting called for this morning, Sullivan said without preamble. Gerald Blackwell is demanding the school board vote again on Miss Summers's employment. He's claiming she committed burglary and should be terminated immediately. On what evidence? Josephine stepped into view, her chin lifted defiantly. On the testimony of himself, Thomas Holloway, and Marcus. They're saying you broke into his study last night and stole documents. Sullivan's eyes were kind but worried. Dr. Brennan is planning to speak in your defense, but Josephine, you need to understand. The town is divided. Half believe Blackwell's version, half are starting to question everything they've been told about the mine explosion. It's going to get ugly. Let it get ugly. Josephine's voice rang with conviction. The truth is ugly sometimes. That doesn't mean we should hide from it. The meeting convened at 8 o'clock in the church hall, and it seemed like every resident of Redemption Creek had crowded inside. Josephine walked down the center aisle with Archer beside her, feeling the weight of judgment from every side. Blackwell sat at the front, like a judge, his expression carved from stone. This emergency meeting is called to address the criminal actions of Miss Josephine Summers. He began, his voice carrying through the packed hall. Last night, she broke into my home and stole private documents. She has admitted as much to Dr. Brennan, who was witness to her crime. That's not exactly what happened, Brennan said, rising from his seat. What I witnessed was Miss Summers holding maps that appeared to show fraudulent alteration of territorial surveys. What I witnessed was you, Gerald, attempting to intimidate her into silence about those alterations. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Blackwell's face darkened. That's a lie. Is it? Brennan pulled the maps from his jacket, holding them up for everyone to see. These documents tell a very different story. A story about water rights theft, about forged surveys, about a powerful man who's been using fear and violence to maintain control over this town. You have no proof those maps are anything other than legitimate business documents. Then you won't mind if I take them to Denver today for independent authentication. Brennan's voice was steady, implacable. If they're genuine, you have nothing to fear. If they're forged, then we all have a great deal to discuss about the mine explosion and the men who died in it. The hall erupted into chaos. Voices rose in argument, accusation, defense. Josephine saw Rosa Martinez standing in the back, tears streaming down her face, her hand clutched over her heart. She saw Sarah Blackwell slip through a side door, unable to face the unraveling of her father's lies. She saw Emma Blackwell staring at her grandfather with confusion that would someday harden into understanding. Enough! Reverend Sullivan's voice cut through the noise. There will be order in this house of God. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd settled. Sullivan looked at Josephine with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Miss Summers, did you break into Gerald Blackwell's study last night? Josephine stood, feeling the eyes of the entire town upon her. This was the moment of truth, the point where she either condemned herself with honesty or saved herself with lies. She thought of Archer, scarred and accused, standing alone against an entire town's hatred. She thought of Miguel Martinez and the other miners dead because they'd tried to speak truth to power. She thought of every lesson she'd ever tried to teach about courage and integrity. Yes, she said clearly. I broke into his study. I picked the lock on his desk. I took those maps without permission. And I would do it again because sometimes breaking an unjust law is the only way to expose a greater injustice. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, Rosa Martinez began to clap, slow and deliberate, each sound echoing through the hall like a heartbeat. One by one, others joined her. Dr. Brennan, Reverend Sullivan, Mr. Patterson from the feed store, Emma Blackwell, her young face set with determination that made her grandfather flinch. But others remained silent, their faces closed and hostile. Thomas Holloway, Marcus, Samuel Chen. The town's division was no longer invisible. It had been laid bare for everyone to see. This is madness, Blackwell roared. You're applauding a confessed criminal. We're applauding someone who had the courage to do what the rest of us were too afraid to do, Sullivan said quietly. To question, to investigate, to demand truth instead of accepting comfortable lies. I want her arrested. Marcus, do your job. Marcus stood slowly, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. But before he could take a step, Dr. Brennan moved to stand beside Josephine, and then Reverend Sullivan, and then Mr. Patterson. One by one, the people who had voted to keep her employed formed a barrier between her and the deputy. You'll have to arrest all of us, Brennan said. And I don't think the territorial judge will look kindly on a town that imprisons its citizens for demanding honest government. Marcus looked at Blackwell, then at the crowd, then back at Blackwell. Something shifted in his expression, doubt maybe, or the first stirring of conscience. I'll need to consult with the territorial marshal before making any arrests in a case this complicated. It was a small victory, but it was enough. Blackwell knew he'd lost this round, even if the war was far from over. He stood his dignity wrapped around him like armor despite the cracks beginning to show. "This isn't finished," he said, his voice carrying quiet menace. "Not by a long shot." He swept from the hall, Thomas Holloway scurrying after him like a loyal dog. The crowd began to disperse, some people avoiding Josephine's eyes, others stopping to shake her hand or murmur words of support. Rosa Martinez embraced her, sobbing words in Spanish that Josephine didn't need to understand to feel their gratitude. When the hall had finally emptied, Josephine found herself alone with Archer, the morning sun streaming through the windows and illuminating the space where she'd just publicly confessed to a crime, and somehow emerged not in chains, but in triumph. "You're magnificent," Archer said softly. "Terrifying and magnificent." "I'm scared," Josephine admitted, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving her shaking. "Blackwell's not going to stop. He's going to come after both of us with everything he has." "I know." Archer pulled her close, his embrace steady and sure. "But now we're not alone anymore. You gave people permission to doubt him, to question him. You started something here today that can't be stopped. Or I started something that will get us both killed. Maybe." Archer tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "But I'd rather die fighting beside you than live another day in the prison of his lies." Josephine kissed him, then right there in the church hall, where she'd just torn apart the comfortable fiction that had governed Redemption Creek for 2 years. The kiss tasted of hope and defiance of love, born in conflict and tempered by shared danger. When they finally broke apart, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had chosen Archer over safety, truth over comfort, justice over peace. And whatever came next, arrest, exile, or vindication, she would face it with her eyes open and her heart full of the fierce certainty that some battles were worth fighting no matter the cost. Dr. Brennan left for Denver that afternoon with the map secured in his medical bag, but the uneasy peace that settled over Redemption Creek felt more like the calm before a storm than any real reprieve. Josephine returned to teaching the next morning, walking into the schoolhouse with her head high, despite knowing that half the town now viewed her as a criminal and the other half as a hero. The division made everything feel fragile, like glass about to shatter. Emma Blackwell wasn't in her seat. Neither were the Chen children or the 2 Holloway boys. 6 empty desks stood as silent accusations, parents who had withdrawn their children rather than let them be taught by a woman who had broken into a home regardless of the reason. "Miss Summers," a small voice from the back row. "Jenny Patterson, the feed store owner's granddaughter. My grandpa says you're the bravest person in Redemption Creek. Is that true?" Josephine felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear, Jenny. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. So I suppose your grandfather is half right. I was certainly terrified. But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." The remaining 17 children absorbed this lesson in courage more profoundly than any textbook could teach. But Josephine's satisfaction was short-lived. At noon, Thomas Holloway appeared at the schoolhouse door, his face flushed with exertion or anger or both. "The bank is calling in Archer Grayson's loan," he announced without preamble. "Payment in full is due within 30 days, or we foreclose on his ranch." Josephine's blood ran cold. That loan isn't due for another year. There's a clause about character fitness. Given recent events and the accusations against Mr. Grayson, the bank has determined he no longer meets our standards for credit worthiness. Holloway's smile was thin and cruel. "It's all perfectly legal, Miss Summers. Unlike burglary." She wanted to throw something at his smug face, wanted to scream that they were manipulating the law to punish a man for daring to stand up to them. Instead, she kept her voice level, professional. "How much does he owe?" $1,200, due in 30 days. Holloway tipped his hat mockingly. "Good luck finding that kind of money in a town that thinks he's a murderer." After he left, Josephine dismissed the children early and rode straight to Archer's ranch. She found him in the barn repairing a broken fence rail, with methodical precision, his movements careful around his still healing shoulder wound. "They're calling in your loan," she said without greeting. Archer's hands stilled on the wood. "I figured they would eventually. How long do I have?" 30 days. $1,200. He set down the rail and turned to face her, his expression resigned rather than shocked. "I have maybe 300 in savings. The rest is tied up in land and cattle that I can't sell fast enough to make the deadline. Then we'll find another way. Josephine." He caught her hands, stopping her frantic planning. "There is no other way. Blackwell owns the bank. He's wanted this land for years and now he's finally getting it. The fight is over." "No." The word came out fierce and absolute. "The fight isn't over until we say it is. Dr. Brennan will come back with proof that those maps were forged, and when he does, Blackwell's power will crumble. We just need to hold on until then. And if the authentication takes longer than 30 days, if Brennan can't prove forgery beyond reasonable doubt..." Archer's voice was gentle but realistic. "I appreciate your faith, but I'm also a practical man. I need to prepare for the likelihood that I'm going to lose everything." Josephine felt tears burn behind her eyes, frustration and helplessness warring in her chest. She had fought so hard, risked so much, and still the forces arrayed against them seemed insurmountable. But then she thought of Rosa Martinez clapping in that church hall, of Reverend Sullivan and Dr. Brennan standing as a human shield between her and arrest, of 17 children still sitting in her classroom, learning that courage mattered more than comfort. "Then we fight anyway," she said, her voice breaking, but her resolve iron hard. "Even if we lose, we fight. Because surrendering means letting them win without a battle, and I won't do that. I won't let you do that." Archer pulled her into his arms, and she felt him tremble, whether with emotion or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. "What did I do to deserve you? You tried to save 7 men who had already condemned you. You refused to run when running would have been easier. You showed me what integrity looks like, even when it costs everything." She pulled back to look at him. "You deserve everything good in this world, Archer Grayson, and I'm going to make sure you get it." That night, Josephine lay awake in her boarding house room, her mind churning through possibilities. There had to be something they were missing, some piece of evidence or testimony that could turn the tide before Archer lost his ranch. Sarah Blackwell knew the truth, but was too afraid to speak it. The territorial authorities were too far away and too slow to help. The town was divided but powerless against Blackwell's financial control. The answer came to her just before dawn, sharp and clear as a bell. The mine itself. If Blackwell had sabotaged the explosion to silence Miguel Martinez and the other men who knew about the forged documents, there would be evidence at the mine site. Traces of deliberate destruction that couldn't be explained by accident or gas buildup. She just needed someone who understood mining to examine it. She found Archer at breakfast and laid out her plan. His immediate reaction was exactly what she expected. "Absolutely not. That mine is unstable, half-collapsed, and potentially deadly. I'm not letting you go down there." "Then come with me. You know mining your father worked the claims before he started ranching. You'd know what to look for." "I barely survived the last time I went into that mine, Josephine. I'm not eager to repeat the experience." "I'm not asking you to be eager. I'm asking you to help me find the truth." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "The territorial judge won't just take our word about forgery. He needs evidence of motive. If we can prove Blackwell deliberately caused that explosion to cover up his theft and eliminate witnesses, it changes everything. It makes this about murder, not just property disputes." Archer was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a nervous rhythm she'd come to recognize as his thinking tell. "There's a man. Chenwei Samuel Chen's brother. He worked the mine before the explosion, knows every tunnel and shaft. He's been living rough in the mountains since it happened, won't come into town. But he might talk to us." "Can you find him?" if he wants to be found. Archer's expression was grim. But Josephine, you need to understand what you're asking. Going into that mine, bringing up the explosion again, it's going to make Blackwell desperate. Desperate men do desperate things. He's already tried to kill you twice. How much more desperate can he get? The words had barely left her mouth when the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside, followed by shouting. Josephine and Archer rushed to the door to find Marcus, the deputy, dismounting with unusual urgency. Dr. Brennan's stage was attacked on the road to Denver. Marcus set his face pale. 3 masked men. They took his medical bag and everything in it. Josephine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Is he alive? Barely. The driver managed to fight them off before they could finish the job, but Brennan's badly beaten. They're bringing him back to town now. Marcus's eyes met Josephine's with something that looked almost like apology. The maps are gone. Whoever attacked him took them. Blackwell. Josephine spat the name like a curse. He hired men to stop Brennan from reaching Denver. You don't know that, Marcus said, but his voice carried no conviction. Don't I? Who else would benefit from those maps disappearing? Who else has been trying to silence anyone who questions his claims? Josephine turned to Archer. We need to get to that mine, now. It's the only evidence left. But before they could move, Sarah Blackwell appeared at the edge of Archer's property, stumbling through the morning mist like a ghost. Her dress was torn, her hair disheveled, and her face bore the unmistakable imprint of a man's hand across her cheek. Sarah. Archer moved toward her instinctively, and Josephine saw the way his body still responded to her presence despite everything. It made something twist in her chest, not jealousy exactly, but the recognition that first loves leave marks that never fully fade. He knows. Sarah gasped, collapsing into Archer's arms. My father knows I was the one who told you about the maps. He heard me talking to the maid admitting I'd hoped you'd find them. She touched her bruised face gingerly. He's never hit me before. But last night when the men came back with Brennan's bag, he asked if I'd told anyone else about the study. I couldn't lie. I've lived with lies for 2 years and I just couldn't anymore. Josephine stepped forward, her anger at Sarah's earlier cowardice dissolving in the face of the woman's genuine terror and regret. What did you tell him? That I told you the maps existed. That I wanted Archer to find proof because I couldn't live with what I'd done anymore. Sarah's voice broke. He said I betrayed him. He said I was dead to him. Then he locked me in my room and said he was going to take care of this problem permanently. Take care of what problem? Archer's voice was tight with controlled fear. You. Both of you. He's hiring men to burn down your ranch, Archer. Tonight while you sleep. He said it would look like an accident revenge from the miners' families maybe, and with you both dead, there'd be no one left to question the water rights. The words landed like blows. Josephine saw Marcus's face go white with shock, saw the moment the deputy finally understood the depth of Blackwell's corruption. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about murder planned and calculated. I need to arrest him, Marcus said, his voice shaking. I need to God I should have done this months ago. On what charge? Archer's voice was heavy with bitter experience. Sarah's testimony. She's his daughter. Any judge will say she's biased or confused. Threats he made in private, he'll deny it. We need proof, Marcus. Real undeniable proof. Then we get Chen Wei, Josephine said. We get him to examine that mine and testify about what really caused the explosion. And we do it today, before Blackwell can carry out his threats. They found Chen Wei in a crude shelter high in the mountains, living like a hermit among the rocks and pines. He was gaunt, his eyes haunted by memories that clearly gave him no peace. When he saw Archer approaching, he reached for a rifle, but Josephine stepped forward with her hands raised. Mr. Chen, my name is Josephine Summers. I'm the school teacher. Your brother Samuel's children were in my class before he withdrew them. I know who you are. Chen Wei's voice was rough from disuse. The woman who chose the pariah over the powerful. You're either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both. Josephine didn't lower her hands. We need your help. We need you to come back to the mine and tell us what really caused the explosion. I already told the authorities what I saw. They didn't believe me then. Why would they believe me now? Because now we have context, Archer said quietly. Because now we know about the forged water rights documents and the men who died questioning them. Because now we understand that the mine explosion wasn't random. It was murder designed to look like an accident. Chen Wei lowered his rifle slowly, his face working with emotion. I tried to tell them. I said the blast pattern was wrong for a gas explosion, that the charges were set deliberately in the support beams. But they said I was just a Chinese worker, that my testimony couldn't be trusted over a white mine owner's reputation. His voice turned bitter. So I ran. Figured living alone was better than being the next convenient accident. We're not running anymore, Josephine said, and we need you to stop running too. Come with us to the mine. Show us the evidence. Help us bring the real murderer to justice. Chen Wei studied them for a long moment, this unlikely pair who had somehow found each other in a town built on lies and maintained by fear. Finally, he nodded. I'll do it. But not because I think it will change anything. I'll do it because Miguel Martinez was my friend, and he died trying to protect this town's water supply. He deserves better than to be forgotten while his killer prospers. The mine entrance yawned like a mouth in the hillside darkness, visible even in the bright afternoon sun. Josephine felt her breathing quicken with instinctive fear. The war had taught her what happened in enclosed spaces when fire or explosives were introduced. But she forced herself to follow Chen Wei and Archer into the depths, Marcus bringing up the rear with a lantern and a loaded rifle. The air grew cold and close as they descended, the smell of earth and old smoke thick enough to taste. Chen Wei moved with confidence despite the years away, his body remembering the paths his mind had tried to forget. He stopped at a junction where multiple tunnels branched off, pointing to scorch marks on the walls. Here, this is where the first charge went off. He traced the burn pattern with his finger. See how the blast radiates outward from this specific point. Gas explosions don't work like that. They follow the concentration of gas, usually accumulating in low pockets and igniting when they hit a spark. This originated from a deliberate placement. Archer examined the marks with a growing understanding that Josephine could see, transforming his face from skepticism to horrified certainty. Someone set dynamite here, in the main support beam. 3 charges, Chen Wei corrected, moving deeper into the tunnel. Here, here, and here. Time to go off in sequence, bringing down the whole section and trapping the men in the back shaft. I was supposed to be back there too, but I'd gone to the surface to get more timber. That's the only reason I survived. Can you testify to this in court? Marcus asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. I can testify to what I saw. Whether anyone believes me is another question. They'll believe you when we bring the territorial marshal here and he sees it himself. Josephine's mind was already racing ahead. This is evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. This is murder. They were so focused on the blast marks that none of them heard the approaching footsteps until it was too late. A voice called out from behind them, jovial and terrifying in its false friendliness. Well, well, all my problems in one convenient location. They spun around to find Gerald Blackwell standing in the tunnel entrance, backlit by daylight, a rifle cradled comfortably in his arms. Thomas Holloway flanked him, also armed, along with 2 men Josephine didn't recognize, hired guns by the look of them. Father, no! Sarah's voice came from somewhere behind Blackwell, desperate and pleading. Please, you can't do this. Be quiet, Sarah. You've done enough damage already. Blackwell's eyes never left Archer. I gave you a chance to leave Grayson, multiple chances. But you just couldn't let it go, could you? Had to keep fighting, keep digging, keep turning my own daughter against me. She turned against you when you made her lie for you, Archer said, his voice steady, despite the gun pointed at his chest. "When you killed 7 innocent men to protect your theft, those men were hardly innocent. They were thieves themselves trying to steal what was rightfully mine." Blackwell's face hardened. "But you're right about one thing. I did kill them. And I'm about to kill 4 more. See, this mine is unstable. Everyone knows that. And sometimes foolish people ignore the warnings and go exploring in dangerous places. Tragic accidents happen all the time in mining country." Josephine saw his finger tighten on the trigger and moved without thinking, throwing herself toward Archer just as the shot rang out. The bullet that would have hit Archer's heart instead tore through her side, white-hot pain that stole her breath and sent her crashing to the ground. "Josephine!" Archer's voice raw with anguish. More gunfire erupted, echoing deafeningly in the confined space. Marcus returned fire, and Josephine heard someone scream, "Holloway," she thought, or maybe one of the hired guns. The air filled with smoke and chaos, making it impossible to see, impossible to think through the pain radiating from her side. Then Archer's hands were on her, pressing against the wound with desperate pressure. Stay with me, damn it." "I'm fine," Josephine gasped, even though she could feel blood soaking through her dress in warm, terrifying pulses. "Get Blackwell. Don't let him—" An explosion shook the mine dust and rock raining from the ceiling. Someone had set off dynamite, maybe deliberately, or maybe a stray bullet had hit an old charge left from the mining days. The tunnel began to collapse, the very thing Blackwell had threatened coming to pass. "Move!" Chenwei shouted, grabbing Josephine's other arm. "The whole section's coming down." They ran, half-dragging Josephine through the darkness as the world fell apart around them. Timber supports cracked like gunshots. Rocks tumbled from above one, catching Archer's shoulder and sending him stumbling. Marcus fired again behind them, and Josephine heard Blackwell's voice screaming orders, furious and desperate. They burst out of the mine entrance just as the main shaft collapsed inward with a roar like thunder. Josephine fell to her knees on the grass outside, her vision graying at the edges, Archer's hands still pressed against her wound. "Get the doctor," he was saying, his voice breaking. "Someone get the doctor. She's bleeding too much. She's Josephine, look at me. Look at me." She tried to focus on his face, on the scars she'd learned to love, on the eyes that had seen too much pain and were now watching her slip away with helpless terror. She wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid, that saving his life was worth dying for, that she loved him more than breath itself. But the words wouldn't come, and the world faded to black. Josephine woke to lamplight and pain, the kind of deep, gnawing ache that told her she'd come close to death, but somehow survived. Dr. Brennan's face swam into focus above her, bruised and battered from his own ordeal, but alive and working with steady competence. "Easy," he murmured as she tried to sit up. "The bullet went clean through, missed anything vital. You'll heal, but you need to stay still." "Blackwell." Her voice came out as a croak. "Dead. The mine collapse trapped him and Holloway in the back shaft. Marcus and the 2 hired guns made it out. But Blackwell—" Brennan's expression was complicated relief, mixed with something that might have been pity. "Justice, I suppose, though not the kind we'd hoped for." Josephine absorbed this feeling, none of the triumph she'd expected. A man was dead, even if he'd been trying to kill them. His crimes would never be tried in a court of law. His victims would never hear him confess. "Archer." "Right here." His voice came from beside the bed, and she turned her head to find him sitting in a chair pulled close, his hand wrapped around hers. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in however long she'd been unconscious, his face drawn with exhaustion and lingering fear. "I thought I'd lost you," he said simply. "When you threw yourself in front of that bullet, I thought—" His voice broke. "Don't ever do that again." "Can't make that promise." Josephine managed a weak smile. "You have a tendency to get shot at." "Then I'll have to stop getting shot at." Archer raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "Because I can't watch you bleed for me again. I can't." The loan, forgiven. Holloway's cousin is the acting bank president now, and he's declared the character clause invalid. Says it was never legally enforceable in the first place, that his cousin added it specifically to target me. Archer's smile was slight, but genuine. The ranch is safe. The water rights are being reviewed by the territorial authorities, but Chen Wei's testimony and the evidence from the mine pretty much guarantee they'll be restored to their original boundaries. So we won. You won. You and your stubborn refusal to let injustice stand. Archer's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. You changed everything, Josephine. This whole town, me, everything. Dr. Brennan cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll give you two some privacy. But Archer, don't let her talk too long. She needs rest. After he left, Josephine and Archer sat in silence for a while, the lamplight casting soft shadows across the room. Finally, Josephine spoke the thought that had been forming since she woke. I was so focused on clearing your name that I never stopped to think about what that name clearing would cost you. All these years you've carried those scars as proof of your heroism, but also as armor against getting close to anyone. Now the town knows you're innocent, knows you tried to save those men. The armor's gone, Archer. Everyone can see you clearly now. Archer was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and traced the scars on his own face, the gesture self-conscious in a way she'd never seen from him before. I'm not sure what they see when they look at me now. I'm not the villain anymore, but I'm not quite the hero either. I'm just a man who survived something terrible and lived to tell about it. Let me tell you what I see. Josephine pulled his hand from his face and held it between both of hers. I see someone who chose integrity over safety. Someone who stood alone against an entire town's judgment and never once compromised his principles. Someone who runs into burning mines to save people who hate him. I see scars that tell a story of courage, not shame. She pulled him closer, ignoring the protest from her wounded side, and kissed the scars on his face. First the long one that ran from temple to jaw, her lips tracing its path with deliberate tenderness. Then the smaller ones scattered across his cheekbone and the corner of his mouth. With each kiss, she felt him tremble, felt walls that had been built from years of rejection and isolation beginning to crumble. These scars are beautiful, she whispered against his skin, because they're proof you survived, proof you fought, proof you're human and breakable, and still here despite everything that tried to destroy you. Archer's breath hitched, and when he pulled back to look at her, there were tears on his face, the first she'd ever seen him shed. I don't know how to be loved, Josephine. I don't know how to let someone that close without waiting for them to leave or lie or betray me. Then we'll learn together. She cupped his scarred face in her hands, holding his gaze with absolute certainty. Because I'm not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You're stuck with me, Archer Grayson, scars and all. The week Josephine spent recovering became the week Redemption Creek began to heal itself. Sarah Blackwell appeared at the boarding house on the third day, her belongings packed in a single trunk, her eyes red from crying but her spine straight with newfound resolve. I'm leaving, she announced without preamble, going to my aunt's in San Francisco. I can't stay here anymore, not with my father's crimes hanging over everything, not with the way people look at me. Josephine sat up carefully in bed, Dr. Brennan having finally allowed her to receive visitors. You could stay. You could help rebuild what your father destroyed. How? Sarah's laugh was bitter. Every time someone looks at me, they'll see him. They'll remember that I lied, that I helped destroy an innocent man's reputation because I was too weak to stand up to my father. They'll also remember that you tried to warn us, that you finally chose truth over loyalty. Josephine gestured to the chair beside her bed. Sit down, Sarah, please. Sarah hesitated, then sank into the chair like her legs could no longer hold her weight. I loved him, you know, Archer. I loved him so much it terrified me. And when my father said I had to choose between Archer's life and his freedom, I thought I was making the noble sacrifice. I thought losing his reputation was better than losing his life. but you didn't trust him with the choice. Josephine kept her voice gentle but honest. You made the decision for him, and that's not love. That's control disguised as protection. I know that now. Sarah's voice broke. I watch the way you two are together, and I see what real love looks like. You trust him. You fight beside him, not for him. You don't try to save him from himself. I trust him to make his own choices, even when those choices scare me. Josephine reached for Sarah's hand. You can learn to do that too. Maybe not here, maybe not with Archer, but somewhere with someone. You can learn to be brave. Sarah squeezed her hand once hard, then stood. I hope so. And I hope he's happy with you. I hope you both get the life I was too cowardly to build with him. After she left, Josephine found herself crying for the first time since the shooting. Not for the pain in her side, or the fear she'd felt in that collapsing mine, but for the waste of it all. The years Archer had spent alone, the men who had dyed the town, that had festered under Blackwell's corruption. All of it could have been prevented if one woman had found her courage sooner. Hey! Archer appeared in the doorway, his face creased with concern. I heard Sarah was here. Are you all right? I'm sad for her, for all the time that was lost. Josephine wiped her eyes roughly. She loved you, Archer, really loved you. She just didn't know how to love you well. I know. Archer settled into the chair Sarah had vacated, his expression thoughtful rather than wounded. I was angry at her for a long time. Furious, actually. But watching her these past few days, seeing how destroyed she is by guilt, I can't hold on to that anger anymore. She's punishing herself far more than I ever could. That's very mature of you. Don't give me too much credit. I'm mostly just relieved to be done with the whole mess. He took Josephine's hand, his thumb finding the familiar path across her knuckles. Speaking of which, the territorial judge arrived this morning. He wants to take depositions from everyone involved, you, me, Chen Wei, Marcus, even Sarah before she leaves. Will they charge Marcus as an accessory? No. He's agreed to testify fully about Blackwell's corruption and Holloway's involvement. The judge says his cooperation and the fact that he ultimately tried to protect us will keep him out of prison. Archer's expression darkened slightly. Though he'll lose the deputy position. The new sheriff they're appointing doesn't want anyone connected to the old regime. Josephine absorbed this news, feeling the weight of how completely their world had shifted in such a short time. What about the town? How are people handling all of this? Divided, confused, angry at themselves mostly. Archer stood and moved to the window, his shoulders tense. Rosa Martinez stood up in the general store yesterday and told everyone that she'd known the truth about her husband's death for 2 years, but was too afraid to speak. She said Blackwell had threatened to burn down her house with her children inside if she ever told anyone what Miguel had discovered. God! Josephine felt sick. How many others did he threaten? We're finding out more every day. The feed store owner, Mr. Patterson Blackwell, had been pressuring him to sell his land for months, threatening to ruin his credit if he didn't. The banker who died in that riding accident? His widow finally admitted that it wasn't an accident. Someone cut through his saddle girth part way so it would snap during his ride. Archer's voice was hollow. This whole town has been living under a reign of terror, and most people were too scared to even acknowledge it. The enormity of it hit Josephine like a physical blow. Blackwell hadn't just corrupted the water rights system, he'd corrupted the entire community, turning neighbor against neighbor through fear and intimidation. Healing from that would take more than a judge's ruling or a villain's death. Then we give them permission to heal, she said firmly. We show them that speaking truth doesn't mean death anymore. We build something better. Archer turned from the window, and the look on his face made her breath catch. We? You keep saying we. Of course I do. Josephine, you almost died. You were shot, protecting me, nearly crushed in a mine collapse, and you're talking about staying here and rebuilding this broken town like it's the most natural thing in the world. His voice was rough with emotion. You could leave. Go somewhere safe, somewhere that doesn't have memories of violence in every corner. Why would you stay? Because you're here. The answer was simple, absolute. Because this town needs teachers who will tell the truth. Because I've spent enough of my life running from hard things, and I'm done running. You're impossible. I'm in love. There's a difference. Josephine held out her hand. Come here. He crossed to her, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. Josephine cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I need you to understand something, Archer Grayson. I didn't choose you because I felt sorry for you or because I wanted to save you. I chose you because when I look at you, I see the kind of man I want to build a life with. Someone honest and brave and stubborn enough to stand up to injustice even when it costs everything. Someone who kisses me like I'm precious and argues with me like I'm his equal. Someone whose scars tell a story I want to spend the rest of my life learning to read. Archer's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I don't have much to offer you. A ranch that needs work, a reputation that's still rebuilding scars inside and out. You have yourself, that's everything. She pulled him down into a kiss that tasted of salt and promise of healing and hope, and the fierce certainty that they had survived the worst and could face anything that came next. When they broke apart, Archer rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. Josephine's heart stuttered. What? Marry me. Not someday, not when things settle down, not when I've proven myself worthy. Now. As soon as you're healed enough to stand through a ceremony. His voice was urgent, almost desperate. I've wasted too much of my life waiting for the right moment, and I'm done waiting. I want to wake up beside you every morning. I want to fight with you, and laugh with you, and build something beautiful out of all this ugly history. Marry me, Josephine. She wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to throw herself into his arms and damn the wound in her side. But something made her pause, made her search his face for the real question beneath the words. Are you asking me because you love me, or because you're afraid of losing me? Archer pulled back slightly, his expression arrested. Does it matter? Yes. Because I won't marry you out of fear. I won't be the woman you cling to because you're terrified of being alone again. Josephine's voice was gentle, but firm. I'll marry you when you're ready to choose me, not because I saved your life or fought for your vindication, but because you genuinely want to spend every ordinary day with me. The boring ones, the hard ones, the ones where nothing dramatic happens and we're just two people trying to make a life work. I want those days. Archer's voice broke slightly. God, Josephine, I want the boring days with you more than I've ever wanted anything. I want to watch you teach 23 children how to think for themselves. I want to argue with you about whether to plant corn or wheat in the north field. I want to sit on the porch at sunset and listen to you read aloud from whatever book you're obsessed with that week. I'm asking you to marry me because I love you, not because I'm afraid. Though I am afraid, terrified actually, because loving you means risking the kind of loss I'm not sure I'd survive. Then we're both terrified. Josephine smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. And we're both choosing each other anyway. Yes, Archer. Yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed was interrupted by Dr. Brennan's pointed cough from the doorway. I'm delighted for you both, truly. But Josephine's wound is still healing, and I'd prefer not to explain to the town how the schoolteacher died from excessive celebration of her engagement. They broke apart laughing, and Josephine saw the joy on Archer's face, unguarded and brilliant, and thought that this moment of pure happiness, after so much pain, was worth every risk she'd taken. The territorial judge's investigation took another 2 weeks, during which time Josephine healed enough to return to teaching, and Archer worked on rebuilding relationships with the townspeople who had shunned him for so long. It wasn't easy. Some people apologized openly, their guilt written across their faces. Others simply started treating him normally, as if the past 2 years had never happened. And a few held on to their prejudice, unable to admit they'd been so thoroughly manipulated. Chen Wei gave his testimony with quiet dignity, his technical explanation of the blast patterns making it impossible to deny that the explosion had been deliberate murder rather than tragic accident. The judge declared Archer fully exonerated, ordered the water rights restored to their original boundaries, and recommended that Blackwell's estate be used to compensate the families of the miners who had died. "The criminal is beyond earthly justice," the judge said in his formal ruling read aloud in the church hall where the whole town had gathered. "But we can ensure his victims are not forgotten and that his crimes do not profit those who survive him." Rosa Martinez wept openly when she received the compensation enough to secure her children's future and buy the small house she'd been renting. Other families received similar settlements, and slowly, painfully, Redemption Creek began the process of acknowledging its collective failure and working toward redemption that actually meant something. But the moment that changed everything came 3 weeks after the mine collapse, when Reverend Sullivan stood before the Sunday congregation and did something unprecedented. He apologized. "I have been your spiritual leader for 15 years, he said, his voice carrying through the packed church. "And in that time, I failed you. I failed to speak up when an innocent man was accused without evidence. I failed to question authority when authority was corrupt. I failed to protect the vulnerable because I was more concerned with keeping the peace than seeking the truth. For this, I am profoundly sorry." The silence that followed was absolute. Then one by one others stood. "Mr. Patterson. I knew Blackwell was lying about the water rights, and I said nothing because I was afraid of losing my business. Samuel Chen. I withdrew my children from Miss Summers' class because I was too cowardly to support someone who was doing the right thing. Mrs. Halloway, the boarding house owner. I spread gossip about Archer without knowing if it was true because gossip made me feel important." On and on it went, a cascade of confessions that transformed the church into something raw and honest and painful. Josephine sat beside Archer, their hands clasped tightly, and felt the town's collective shame washing over them in waves. When the last person had spoken, Reverend Sullivan raised his hands. "We cannot change the past. We cannot bring back the men who died or restore the years Archer Grayson lost to our cruelty. But we can choose differently going forward. We can be the kind of community that values truth over comfort, that protects the vulnerable instead of the powerful, that stands up to injustice even when it costs us dearly. We can be better. And it starts today with each of us making the choice to see clearly and speak honestly, no matter the cost." The church erupted in affirmation voices calling out agreement and commitment. It wasn't a solution. Healing would take years, maybe generations. But it was a beginning. Afterward, as people filed out into the bright Colorado sunshine, Emma Blackwell approached Josephine and Archer with hesitant steps. At 10 years old, she carried the weight of her grandfather's sins on shoulders too small for such burdens. "Miss Summers, I want to come back to your class, if you'll have me." Josephine knelt down, ignoring the twinge from her still healing wound. "Emma, you are always welcome in my classroom. Always. You are not responsible for your grandfather's choices. But everyone knows who I am. Everyone knows what he did. Yes. And everyone also knows that you're the girl who stood up and clapped for me at the school board meeting when your grandfather wanted me fired. Everyone knows that you chose courage over family loyalty, and that's not an easy choice at any age." Josephine touched Emma's cheek gently. "You get to decide who you become, Emma. Your grandfather's legacy doesn't have to be yours." The girl threw her arms around Josephine's neck, sobbing with the relief of a child who had been carrying guilt that didn't belong to her. Over Emma's shoulder, Josephine saw Archer watching with an expression of such tenderness that her heart ached with love for this complicated, wounded, beautiful man who had somehow become her future. They married on a Saturday in late October, when the aspen trees had turned the mountains into rivers of gold, and the air carried the first hint of coming winter. Reverend Sullivan performed the ceremony beside the creek that ran through Archer's property, the same creek that had been at the center of so much conflict, now reclaimed as a symbol of life and renewal. Josephine wore a simple dress that Mrs. Martinez had helped her sew white cotton with blue embroidery that reminded her of forget-me-nots. Archer wore his best suit, the one he'd kept stored away for years without occasion to wear it, and when he saw Josephine walking toward him with wildflowers in her hair, the expression on his face made everyone who witnessed it believe in love again. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the meaning behind them was anything but ordinary. When Josephine promised to honor and cherish Archer, she was promising to see past the scars to the man beneath. When Archer promised to love and protect Josephine, he was promising to let her be strong instead of trying to shield her from every danger. They were promising to build a life based on trust and truth and the hard-won knowledge that real love required courage. Dr. Brennan handed Archer the ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to Archer's mother, saved all these years. For a moment he'd stopped believing would come. Archer's hands shook as he slipped it onto Josephine's finger, his voice rough with emotion. "With this ring I thee wed, and with everything I am and everything I have, I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you, but beside you, as your equal and your partner." Josephine's own vows emerged through tears of joy. "I take you, Archer Grayson, with all your scars and all your strength, with all your pain and all your hope, to be my husband and my best friend today and every day that follows." When Reverend Sullivan pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted of redemption and new beginnings of a future they had fought for and earned through their refusal to surrender to fear or hatred, or the easy lies that poisoned communities from the inside out. The celebration that followed was simple but genuine. Rosa Martinez had prepared enough food to feed the entire town, and people who had spent 2 years avoiding Archer's company now raised glasses to toast his happiness. Chen Wei came down from his mountain hermitage for the occasion, offering his congratulations with the awkward dignity of a man learning to be part of a community again. Even Marcus attended, no longer a deputy, but working as a ranch hand for one of the smaller landowners trying to rebuild his own reputation through honest labor. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Josephine found herself standing alone with Archer by the creek, the sounds of celebration fading to a pleasant hum behind them. She leaned into his warmth, feeling his arm come around her waist with the easy familiarity of someone who knew they belonged there. "What are you thinking?" Archer asked softly. "That we made it. Against all odds, against all the forces arrayed against us, we made it to this moment." Josephine turned in his arms to face him. "And I'm thinking about all the days ahead of us, the ordinary ones and the extraordinary ones. The days we'll fight, and the days we'll laugh, and the days we'll just exist together in comfortable silence. I'm thinking about children." Archer's voice held a note of wonder, as if he was speaking a dream he'd never dared voice before. "About teaching them to ride and watching you teach them to read. About building something that lasts beyond us. Children." Josephine tested the word, finding it fit perfectly into the future she'd been imagining. Yes. Children who grow up knowing that standing up for what's right matters more than being popular or powerful. Children who learn that love is a choice you make every day, not just a feeling that comes and goes. Children who know their mother is the bravest person in Redemption Creek. Archer kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. And that their father is the luckiest man alive. The stars began to emerge overhead, diamonds scattered across darkening velvet, and Josephine thought about all the nights she'd lain awake during the war, wondering if she'd survive to see another day. She thought about the morning she'd arrived in Redemption Creek, weary and uncertain, and hoping for nothing more than a quiet place to teach. She thought about the moment she'd pressed her hands against Archer's bleeding chest and chosen to fight for his life instead of walking away safely. Every choice, every risk, every moment of courage had led her here to this creek, beside this man, building a future on the foundation of truth they'd fought so hard to uncover. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It was infinitely better. "Thank you," Archer said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. For what? For seeing me when everyone else looked away. For kissing my scars instead of flinching from them. For loving me when I was too hard to love, when I'd given up on being loved at all. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. For refusing to let this town's lies become my truth. You were never too hard to love, Archer. Josephine pressed her palm against his scarred cheek, feeling the familiar texture of healed wounds beneath her fingers. You just needed someone brave enough to love you honestly. And I found her. Against all odds, in the middle of a war between truth and corruption, I found the woman who would change everything. Archer's smile was brilliant and unguarded, the smile of a man who had finally come home. I love you, Josephine Grayson, and I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that love is stronger than fear, that truth is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the best things in life come from having the courage to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. They stood together as twilight deepened into true night. Two people who had been broken by their separate wars and made whole by finding each other. The creek flowed beside them, its water no longer a source of conflict, but a promise of sustenance and life. The town spread out below them, imperfect and healing, learning slowly to choose courage over comfort. And Josephine knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of a marriage built on trust and truth.